you've obviously, I know you had one kind of conversation with Neil Shenvi, who has his concerns with CRT and makes those very clear on social media. Obviously, as you discuss with him and other people like him, you're able to say, hey, we believe in the same things about scriptures, we believe the same thing about the sinfulness of man and whatnot. There doesn't always seem to be the ability to convince others of the reality that as we see it, right? Where do you feel that comes from? Like, where's the rub not hidden?
Yeah, and that's a good question. And I think, I appreciate the nuance that DA has added to the conversation in terms of there's a tendency, I think, in our polarized society right now for us to oversimplify people into like one category or another. And I think we're saying, hey, don't do that to us when we're trying to make racial analyses and even leveraging insights, from various academic sources that are not necessarily based in a Christian worldview or a Christian understanding of things. And I wouldn't want to do that to others as well. I know that there's a whole panorama of reasons why there are concerns that people are having. But I think in the midst of that, the things that I've seen the most, especially in the interactions that I've had with Neil and others, has been this idea of a slippery slope, where if we accept that these kind of social emphases right now, this justice conversation, if we accept that, then it will slide us into a space where we are unknowingly, unwittingly, taking in and imbibing beliefs that run counter to our faith, specifically as it relates to identity issues. So whether that's gender roles, that tends to seem to come up, or sexuality and gender identity in terms of how we see the LGBT community, and how to respond to those things. That and just in general, maybe the place of the church, because people who tend to hold these views tend to also be very antagonistic toward a Christian teaching or space for the church. And so the underlying kind of fear that I've seen is that that we see out there, and we look at who is kind of making noise about race and racism or injustice, and we see that they have beliefs that are increasingly at odds or opposed to a Christian understanding. And we are afraid that that the one is related to the other. The more that someone is committed to social justice, then the more that someone is committed to these other things. That's kind of what I see as an underlying, oftentimes unspoken concern that exists. And I think it comes from a reality of the fact, and this is where it's kind of tough, is that when one comes from the vantage point that all that we have in terms of as a point of emphasis as evangelicals is all that we should ever have, and came from on high, and that our tradition didn't miss anything, then any attempt to correct or to critique or to say, hey, there's some things that we should be talking about that our churches haven't historically talked about, is seen as a bringing in a foreign substance that doesn't belong. But the problem is that in doing so, we're actually guilty of the same things that the very Reformation was opposing, which was this idea that that tradition has as much weight as the scriptures do. But as I look at the scriptures, I look at the commitment that we see in Micah 6:8. What does God require of you, O man, but to love mercy, do justice and walk humbly before your God? Is right there in the text. When I look at Isaiah, when I look at all of these different passages, Jesus in Luke chapter 4, like it's all there. But there's a tendency to want to explain those away and remove that and not to add to the reality or speak to the reality that these things don't have any place to be talked about in the church. For even though they have historically, the number one reason in the Black community, and this is an evangelical issue, that people have evangelistic issue rather about even sometimes considering their faith, is because of the history of slavery in the church. right? Like the ethical issue causes people to be hesitant that we have good news to offer. And so these things are very important in our context, but unfortunately people are missing that because that's maybe not their context. And ironically, they're actually supporting one of the main truths of critical race theory, which DA mentioned earlier, that lived experiences and stories are important, but that they tend to get overlooked. And so I think that those fears, those latent fears and concerns are at the core. I don't think that they're necessary fears that we ought to have as we hold on to watching our life and doctrine closely, but I think that's where it comes from.